Hi, everybody, and welcome to Monday. I'm Laura Clark, one of the special education consultants at the co-op.
And I am Kim Snowball. I am the math consultant at the co-op.
And we are excited to share with you some ideas around the big picture of supporting students with disabilities. When we talk about supporting students with disabilities, one of the key documents that we need to be aware of as teachers is the student's individualized education program, or their IEP. If you haven't had a chance yet to check out the Kentucky Department of Education's guidance document for developing IEPs, you can access that on KDE's website, and you see a screenshot of the document up in the upper right-hand corner. So I've taken a short snip from page 6, which describes the IEP and says that it is that written program for a student with a disability. They have to be eligible to receive special education and related services. And the IEP itself describes the student's strengths and needs. Notes that it starts with focus on the student's strengths, not just their areas of deficit. We always want to take a strength-based approach when we're supporting all students, including students with disabilities, and note where their strengths are. Every IEP is going to have a section called the present levels that describes their strengths and needs. It will have their measurable annual goals. And within those goals, you'll find the specially designed instruction that the special education teacher is going to use to help the student reach that goal. After the special education teacher teaches the student using that SDI, then all other adults can support that specially designed instruction. If the student qualifies for related services such as speech, occupational therapy, or physical therapy, that will be listed in the IEP. You'll also find the supplementary aids and services, as well as the accommodations the student must receive. If a student has supplementary aids and services and or accommodations and modifications, keep in mind that those are not optional. Those are legally binding, and we are required by law to provide those. The people that develop the IEP, it's not just the special education teacher, but rather in Kentucky, it's what we call the Admission and Release Committee, which is the equivalent of an IEP team. And the ARC, is the acronym for that, works together not only to develop the IEP, but if you note in that second paragraph, they also must come together to ensure that the IEP is implemented and review progress towards those measurable annual goals. Parent input is a key component to the IEP development, and they are also key members for that ARC meeting. The reason that we're talking so much about that ARC meeting is that the general education teacher is a required member. If you notice down in that bottom blue box, that the ARC includes the parent, the general and special education teacher who have knowledge of the child, the representative of the school district, who's usually a school administrator, and the student if they are in grade 8 or age 18, as well as a person who can interpret test results if you are looking at test results in that meeting. So here are a few key facts we need to know about IEPs. The first is that IEPs and any ARC meetings are all about what we call data-driven decision making, meaning any decision that we make has to have data to support it. So we're always going to analyze the data and then make a decision, which means if you are going to an ARC meeting for a student, you need to bring with you and share prior to the meeting the data you have for the student. And we're not just talking about grades, although that is an important component, but rather the specific data that you have specific to their area of disability. When you are in an ARC meeting, there are many roles that you will take at the meeting. One is to share data of how the student is doing in the general education setting. Another is to share expectations for students in that grade level or age level. So we're talking about same age peers or same grade peers. What do sixth graders do in math at that grade level? What do third graders do in language arts? Whatever grade the student is, you're going to share the expectations for students, the academic standards for that grade. We're looking at the academic content. We're also talking about the social, emotional, and behavioral expectations for students. So if you have anonymized work samples, if you have some key standards that are expected to be mastered in that grade, that's all important information that you can bring and share. The data that's most important to be able to share is specific to the student's area of eligibility. So, for example, if the student qualifies with a specific learning disability and reading fluency, then you would want to share specific data about how fluently they're able to read as compared to their peers. When we think about recommended practice, for sure, at the beginning of the year, you want to review every student that has an IEP. And I would recommend going through that with the special education teacher to say, okay, what are the key points I need to know to support this student and help them be successful in my room? What are the accommodations that they have for testing? And if they have any other supports, such as a behavior intervention plan, that need to be implemented while the student is with me. If the student is on your roster but is not frequently in your room, they might be in a classroom for students with more significant disabilities, then the recommended practice is to spend time getting to know that student and to work with the special education teacher on areas and activities where that student can be included in the general education classroom and with same age peers to the greatest extent possible. That's what the law requires. When we talk about another recommended practice, definitely working closely with a special education teacher to provide data and identify those key academic standards are very important to support your students in their success in the classroom. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the key facts to support students with disabilities in your classroom. On our NKCES website, we have all kinds of online trainings. Right now, we have more than 50 trainings that are designed to support students with disabilities. So you'll find resources and supports on areas like trauma-informed care and behavior interventions, supports for students with cortical visual impairments and students who qualify as deaf and hard of hearing. If a student comes to you and has an interpreter, we have a module for that. If you have a student with autism in your classroom, modules for that also. So we'd encourage you to check on our online training website and also on KDE's website for key forms and information. We know that above all else, when it comes to student records, we want to protect student privacy. So a few things to remember about IEPs. First of all, you'll follow all of your district protocols and requirements, the state and federal requirements. Those include not sharing the IEP with anyone who is not part of the student's teaching team and anyone who hasn't signed the required confidentiality forms that you have signed as a district employee. You can't leave the IEP lying out. It can't be accessible for others. If your computer isn't locked and someone could get in to your computer and access your files, that would be inappropriate. So make sure that you've protected student privacies, just like you would with grades. Keep all of those records hidden and confidential. Another key component of supporting students with disabilities is to communicate well with families. If the communication is about a class party that's coming up or the student's participation in an activity in your classroom, you will communicate with your families just like you would with every other family. If the communication is specific to the student's IEP or to an accommodation that they have, for example, then the best practice is to work with that special education teacher. And if you are concerned about any areas of the IEP, you'll want to work with your district administrator and the special education teacher and hold an ARC meeting to discuss the IEP with the team. But anything that is in the IEP, we are legally bound to uphold. So as long as it is in the IEP, you'll need to follow what is found there in the document. So, when we're talking about supporting students with disabilities, one of the highest evidence based practices in both academic content and for behavioral expectation is to use explicit instruction, which is sometimes called direct instruction. We use the term explicit instruction as it was originally designed by Anita Archer and Charles Hughes. And when we're talking about explicit instruction, it's above and beyond a scripted program. It's above and beyond concepts like I do, we do, you do that you might have heard of. Explicit instruction actually has 16 key elements that you see here color coded on the screen. And those include 3 elements specific to content, ensuring that we're focusing on the critical content of the standards, that we're sequencing skills logically and breaking down complex skills into their smaller parts. You'll see elements specific to design, like making sure that our lessons are very focused with clear statements or learning targets, that we're always reviewing prior skills before we start instruction on a new skill, that we provide a step-by-step demonstration using clear and concise language, and a critical step of providing an adequate range of both examples and non-examples. And we as teachers are providing guided and supportive practice. When we look at delivering instruction, we want to make sure that we are eliciting frequent responses from our students, that we are not simply talking through the entire class period, but rather engaging with students and getting lots of responses from them, not just at the end of the lesson, but throughout the lesson. That we're monitoring students' performance closely, not as an aha or a got you or looking for students doing it wrong, but rather observing the learning process and providing support for any steps where students might need additional scaffolding. We want to make sure that we're giving lots of immediate, affirmative, and corrective feedback. So we're first of all affirming when students are on the right track, but we're also providing scaffolded support when they need support for a wrong answer. That our instruction is moving at a brisk pace because we are so organized, and that we're helping students organize their knowledge. The final element has to do with practice and making sure that not just in the moment of teaching, but that over time we're providing distributed and cumulative practice of content. So those key elements are actually days and days worth of training to dive fully in. But we have multiple training opportunities at the co-op. Here are 2 online modules that we have available that you can access at any time. And in addition, we often have live and virtual trainings with explicit instruction. So if this is an area that is newer to you, then please check out the 2 modules and check out our trainings face-to-face. We're going to chat about an overview of disability, just to give you some quick thoughts about the IDEA categories of disability and what that looks like in Kentucky and students that you might be working with in your classroom. So we're going to start with just a language primer and a few reminders. We talked earlier about remembering student confidentiality. And so we definitely never want to identify to anyone who does not have the rights to access and know a student's disability category. But other adults that might be part of our classroom might need to know about a student's accommodations or supports that they need. They might need to use a reader, or they might have a scribe or use of technology, or they might need manipulatives. So we want to make sure that we're really thinking and using what we call person first language. So for example, we would never say the autistic kid, the blind kid, but we would rather say the student with autism, the student with low vision, when we're talking with people with whom have a right to know. If the person just needs to know about the accommodation, then we would provide information like, for this assignment, Josh and Sarah can choose alternate seats. And Max will be using his device, his iPad, to use a reader. So you can let people know the supports that a student might need, because all students might need different supports at different times, and they might not have an IEP. It wouldn't just be students with IEPs that would be receiving support in your classroom, possibly. You just want to make sure that what you are sharing with them is in a positive way, as termed by the supports that you're providing, and that you are not looking at that deficit model. You wouldn't say things like, John can't work by himself, so give him a partner, right? But rather, John works really well with a partner, so if he can work with either Keisha or Ramon, that would be great. We also want to avoid thinking in these terms or talking about these terms. Like, Josh suffers. He suffers with diabetes and he's wheelchair bound. Oh my word. Oh, so Sarah is so disabled, right? We don't want to have those thoughts that come out of our mouths. And we really want to stop those thoughts within our heads, because when we start thinking about children in those limiting terms, then we stop expecting great things from them. We also want to avoid thinking in terms of what a student can't do or won't do or doesn't do, because that ascribes meaning that we might not be able to know about a student. We might say, Josh won't ever do his homework, but what we aren't saying is that when Josh goes home, there's no adult to support him. He doesn't have any technology access, and hasn't yet acquired the skills he needs to be independent. So we're going to avoid the can't, won't, and doesn't phrases and really think in terms of what students can do with the right supports. Our focus is always strength-based and thinking through how we as the educators can provide access and supports so students can be successful in our classrooms. When we're talking about students with disabilities who qualify for an IEP, students can actually qualify under 14 categories for disabilities. So when we're thinking about those categories, if you follow along with me, on the left, I'll go across the column. So we have students with autism and hearing impairments, students with specific learning disabilities, and there are several categories within specific learning disability in Kentucky. Students could qualify with deaf blindness. In Kentucky, we have divided intellectual disability into two categories. So the first one you see is mild mental disability. You can also have students that qualify with a speech or language impairment. Developmental delay is just for children when they're ages 3 to 9, and then they would either need to qualify under another category of disability, or they will what we call age out of special education services. Students could qualify with multiple disabilities, a traumatic brain injury, an emotional behavioral disability, an orthopedic impairment, a visual impairment, a functional mental disability, which is a more significant intellectual disability, other health impairments. And when we're thinking about those disability categories, you might have also heard the term MSD, for moderate to severe disabilities. Often students that qualify for a functional mental disability, sometimes students that qualify with autism or deaf blindness, sometimes students that qualify with multiple disabilities or even traumatic brain injury, might be served under that MSD classroom label, or teachers that have that MSD certification. For any category of disability, before a student can qualify and have an IEP, the bottom right white block says you must have parent consent, and not only parent consent for evaluation, but also for permission to provide special education services. All the services that we provide are based on that federal law IDEA. And the Kentucky Department of Education, as well as every state department, has special education forms on their website. I've got the hyperlink here for Kentucky Department of Education's website, so that if you would like to look at the eligibility forms for any of these categories of disability, you can see exactly what the Kentucky Department of Education says a student must have, or the qualifications that a student must exhibit in order to receive an IEP. We have lots and lots of modules to support you as the general education teacher who works with a student with a disability. And this is just a few of the modules here. We worked with our partners throughout the state to create these modules. So you'll see here that Sarah Bays from the Kentucky Autism Training Center created a fantastic module on supporting students with autism in general education classrooms. Tiffany Barnes, who is an interpreter working with students, created a module to help you walk through what you should expect if you are working with an interpreter in the classroom. We worked with Sue Frisbee, who is with the Kentucky School for the Deaf, and created a module, Don't Turn Out the Lights. And then Terry Ritchie, who is with the Kentucky School for the Blind, created two modules for us on cortical visual impairment, one an overview and the other one strategies, and another module specific to having a student with visual impairments in your classroom. So, if you have a student in your classroom with a disability and you would like to learn more, absolutely check in with us. We have lots of modules. Again, they're free and you can take them whenever you would like, whenever is convenient for you. Just to dive a little deeper, when we're thinking about specific learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities, sometimes people get confused about those two categories. So, a student with a specific learning disability is going to have an IQ in the average range, but their academic performance in one or more of the areas listed here is significantly below average. And a student can qualify in either one area or in multiple areas, but the choices are oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, basic reading, reading fluency, reading comprehension, math calculation, and or math reasoning. A student with an intellectual disability, when they qualify, their scores, both IQ and their adaptive skills, both are going to be significantly below average. And they are going to require additional supports and modifications for the curriculum, meaning we're changing the curriculum, usually simplifying it for them. Often, when we talk about students that participate in alternate assessment, often they have an intellectual disability. Students with specific learning disabilities often receive accommodations, which means we are not changing the complexity of the standards of the instruction. We're just providing another way to access that content. So, for example, if they have a specific learning disability in reading fluency, then we might provide a reader for them. But if a student has an intellectual disability, we might be taking that same passage and not only provide a reader, but simplify it from 20 paragraphs to 2 with some picture supports. A few other key things to remember. When we think about categories like autism and traumatic brain injury, we often use the term umbrella because those categories are very broad. So a student might qualify as having autism or a traumatic brain injury, and you might see minimal effect in the general education classroom. They also might have autism and traumatic brain injury and require significant modifications and supports throughout their day. So, just because a student qualifies with one of those categories doesn't mean that there's a very narrow window of what those characteristics might look like in your classroom. In case you weren't aware, we have lots of students that have ADHD. It's not its own category within IDEA. So if a student has ADHD and has significant impact on their learning, then they sometimes qualify under the category Other Health Impairment, or OHI, is how we usually talk about that. It's also important to note that dyslexia is not listed as its own category of disability. Students with dyslexia might qualify as having a specific learning disability in reading fluency. When we think about supporting students that qualify under the broad category EBD, they might have what we call externalizing behaviors or acting out behaviors. So, possibly cursing when they get frustrated or throwing things when they are angry. But students with EBD might also have internalizing behaviors where they have significant anxiety or depression and shut down during instruction. When you're supporting a student with autism, you're thinking about students that have, by its definition, deficits in their communication skills and their social skills. And we may see some behavior challenges where we might need to support them. Having said that, we might see behavior challenges with any student, whether they have an IEP or not. But if a student has an IEP, whether it is for specific learning disability and reading fluency or other health impairments or ABD, if there are behaviors that are impeding their learning, then as an IEP team, we have to consider the data around that behavior to decide if we needed to provide some supports. If you look at that bottom gold box, we've got some language there that's important to remember. Any student that has a disability may have what we call comorbid conditions, which means they have more than one diagnosis. So a student might have another health impairment and another diagnosis that goes along with that. We know in general that students with disabilities are at increased risk for depression and anxiety, for bullying and behavior challenges. So we need to be aware of that possibility and provide behavior supports if the data indicates it is interfering with learning. As a general education teacher, if you see a spike in behaviors, whether that's acting out behaviors or those internalizing behaviors where the student is withdrawing or is no longer trying in class, it's very important that you communicate with the special education teacher and start immediately collecting data around that behavior so that when you have an IEP meeting, you can bring that data to the table to make a data-driven decision.
Thanks, Dr. Laura. We are now moving into topic 3. Inclusion looks like this. And I say go team because we are part of a team. Students are general education students first. And so as a community, each student needs to feel part of that classroom. They need to make sure that they have something as simple as a desk to go to. So assigned seating is very, very much part of best practices because that allows students to take that stress off of where do I go? Is someone going to ask for this seat and ask me to move? Will I be part of this entire room? And will I be valued? So simple things as everyone having an opportunity to have class jobs, a voice when we're doing surveys about decisions that might include topics of something fun or something academic. But all students need to be included. And so when we're thinking about what needs to happen for high quality inclusion, these 3 pieces. Do all students have access to all the opportunities and the activities and experiences that we present in the classroom? Participation. That participation is meaningful from classroom participation in academics to daily routines that we take for granted. And finally, supports. Supports that help teachers, families, and staff promote this inclusion. And so when we think about what can we share with community members, it can be simple as sharing this resource. Brooks Publishing. Brooks Publishing is a free resource that have tips to guest bloggers, to UDL. There's success stories that are shared, but it's a free resource to learn about topics that are in special education. And we want to make sure that everyone understands maybe something as simple as fair is not always equal. They give this wonderful graphic where they, have a little storyline where all kids come in and they have different needs. Someone has a scraped knee, someone has a hurt stomach, and someone might have an arm that's broken, and then someone might have a cough. All different needs that we see within our own classroom. But what happens is in this fair setting is that we have everyone getting cough syrup or getting the same medicine, and it really only meets the needs of one of the students. And that's not fair. It does not mean treating everyone the same. It means striving to meet individual needs. And that is something that we need to make sure that our students are aware of as well. That we all come in and we're going to look at that student and we're going to see what they individually need to help them be successful. So, sharing resources, like I said, this is a free resource. Another piece is that we need to be looking at every student as strengths in all areas. Now, I'm talking about strengths, not comparing students to students and student performance or comparing it to state scores, but really looking at that child. And we refer to this as relative strengths. And so we see students with no comparison to other students, just the student and themselves. And Dr. Laura has a wonderful experience to share with you about relative strengths. Dr. Laura?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kim. So, when we think about relative strengths, the key phrase we want to keep in mind is that every student has relative strengths in every area. And it's a phrase that I don't feel like we can say enough. Every student has relative strengths in every area. And when we think about that and break it down, a great example is my own son, Dan. And so, Dan is now 22, and Dan has autism and epilepsy and also an intellectual disability. And his cognitive functioning attests somewhere between the 18 and 24 month range. And so when he was in high school, and let's just pick 10th grade, for example, when we had his ARC meeting, we talked about his relative strengths in reading. And his relative strengths in reading include that Dan loves rhythm and rhyme. And when given a passage read with rhythm and rhyme, he will attend with eyes on the text or speaker up to 30 seconds, an average reading session. That is his relative strength. Is that anywhere close to grade level? Absolutely not, but it is his relative strength, and we celebrate that. So for every student, we know that we have relative strengths in every area, and we're going to focus on what those relative strengths are. Sometimes we have to reach wide to find those relative strengths, whether a student responds well to fiction or nonfiction, they have a character that they're especially interested in, or a special way that they like to interact. There might be peers that they enjoy learning with the best. They might focus on a specific way that they like to learn, but we're going to focus on that student's relative strengths and make that part of our learning routine. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you, Dr. Laura. Appreciate your insight. A next piece that we want to actually focus on is when we focus on the whole child, the whole person, the whole student. We're really talking about behavior and academic needs. And there is a Supreme Court case from 2017, Andrew F. At the bottom of this slide, you will see that if, in fact, a student's behavior impedes his or her learning or others, then the ARC must develop strategies to ensure success. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about the whole child. And finally, we want to think about family engagement and how that is so important. How we engage the family members in school and classroom events is so critical to the success. As a general education teacher, we want to showcase with all the families all our strategies and supports and activities and events that go on during our daily learning. Another resource we'd like to share with you is this quick access guide. And the purpose is to start conversations with your fellow teachers and administrators on best practices within your district that deal with class culture, environment, instruction, behavior supports, students with IEPs, communications with parents. There's also a second page that is about daily schedules that you put into place, interactions with instructional assistants slash paraeducators, are lesson planning, emergency planning, co-teaching, and then we've left another column for other. Now, each one of the columns are independent of each other, actually are just a quick list of tips and guides to help you when we're talking about um, special education, general education, and supporting all students. Please keep in mind that as you have these conversations with your administration and other teachers, that throughout the year you should be very reflective. Ask yourself, am I still doing this or have I kind of veered off the path? But it is a guide and just a quick way to remind us. Now, when we talk about lesson planning, we cannot be reactionary, meaning we can't just assume that we'll know what to put in place, but we have to purposely plan for each of these services. And so we need to understand our students' IEP, and we need to know what type of supports will take place during our weekly lesson plans. In doing so, one of the pieces that we recommend that you have some very deep conversations about each unit. So there's this base model that we have included a link within that training guide so that you have access to the format. You can type right on it. I've given you an example of a unit that is a statistics unit from a middle school math classroom. This base model, base standing for big idea, is the B, A for analyzing the difficulties, S for strategies and supports, and E for evaluation. What we're looking for is when you think about what Kentucky academic standards are being implemented, you need to be thinking through the unit of study and what are the big ideas in this particular unit. The content teacher, a general education teacher, is responsible for knowing the big ideas, those big rocks, the non-negotiables for that unit. And then when you list those out, you have these conversations with the special education teacher or those other collaborators, and then analyze the difficulties that you might anticipate. Once you start analyzing the difficulties in those big ideas, you need to be thinking through what is a general education teacher, what supports and services will you provide for all students, and then your special education teachers, they are going to be thinking about what supports and services they can pair up and partner up with you so that when they deliver a specially designed instruction that initially that you can then use some of those strategies and supports to help all students. And then the E really is about at the end of that unit, really you're doing an evaluation of that unit plan. And so if you needed to add supports, then you need to document that. If you felt that there were some supports that really didn't work out as you thought they would, then document that too. This is really called macro planning. So it's the big ideas. It's not the day to day lesson planning. The day to day lesson planning actually is really thinking through what type of, for that week, in preparing what type of specially designed instruction, what supplemental aids and services will we be needing, what type of accommodations. And so that really is getting down to each day of the week. But the reason why we ask you to think about this model, it came from Dr. Marilyn Friend. It's because when we think about our students, we need to be thinking through the lens of each unit, each week, each student, and then carefully documenting it. So we want to purposely plan it. We want to have that intentionality when we're delivering it, and that if ever there's questions in mind, that we have documentation to support what we have done and what services we have provided. So the weekly lesson plans really can focus on the particular activities and services as well. Which then leads me to, if you are on a co-teaching team, topic 4. A co-teaching team, Dr. Marilyn Friend has so much information out there. You can do quite a bit of deep dives into her work, but she defines co-teaching very specifically, that it is, in fact, not just co-teaching two professionals in the same space teaching together, but it really is a service delivery mechanism that includes 2 or more professionals with equivalent licensures. That means that it's really a special education teacher and a general education teacher. We're not talking about general education teachers working with a paraeducator or an instructional assistant, but maybe an ELL or a technology specialist. So when we're thinking about what type of environment we've set for co-teaching, there is a lot that goes into it. It is based on really sharing an ownership of that classroom, but the students, all the students. It's shared responsibilities for everyone that's in that classroom. It occurs in a single shared classroom. That means that if you really are truly in a co-teaching environment or co-teaching team, you are in fact sharing the same space. You're not only partially sharing it for the morning and then you take students and move them to a different classroom, but it is about living in that room and as if that's the only location that you have. Now, I'm going back to that lesson plan because I think this is a really wonderful place to add the different types of co-teaching models that you have. We are not including the one teach and one assist, sometimes referred to as one teach and one drift, because it really isn't about having two people in the classroom and one just walking around and making sure that people are on target. This is about the engagement, the interactions between two teachers and two teachers teaching. One teach and one observe of what happens on a daily basis as we collect data, but we're really not thinking about that through the lens of engagement and teaching. We're really looking at station teaching, parallel teaching, alternative teaching, and then team teaching. And so each time we think about which one of these four co-teaching models we're going to implement, we need to be thinking about what is the purpose behind that learning target and the activities the students will be participating in. That's what's going to drive which one of these we actually implement. And there are times that you might be moving through one and then to the other. But as we think about the role that station teaching plays in this, we need to be thinking about in today's society, we're going to be changing this up a little bit. We know we have larger obstacles to overcome with keeping everyone safe and healthy. And so in station teaching, it might be that the teacher rotates, but it is going to be where students more or less are going to be staying put. And in the past, the stations would be set up, and then they would also be, and this is an important piece, they would not be hierarchical, meaning they are independent of each other, so that if you're in station one, you don't need that information in order to go to station two. And finally, just a quick picture of the co-teaching models. And so if you want to just have a quick visual of what it looks like, remember, station teaching, the content is divided. And then the students rotate. When we talk about parallel teaching, both teachers are teaching the same information. Remember that you're really dividing and conquering. You're dividing the student-teacher ratio, and so that you will be interacting with a part of the class, and your co-teaching partner will be operating and working with the other part of the class. We have alternative teaching, and this is really where we are thinking about what type of small group setting can we put in place to meet the individual needs. Then we have teaming, and that is really just kind of like one talks, the other one talks. We finish each other's sentences. It really is both teachers delivering the same instruction at the same exact time. Sometimes someone might be writing on the board, taking the notes, while the other one is actually demonstrating. And so that type of teaming. But remember, in every one of these, there is interactions between the teacher and the students that are active interactions. They're not passive. They're not just observing. They're not just drifting around. So keep that in mind as we think through which model that we will engage in. I just want to make sure that what our role is in co-teaching. Co-teaching, the primary role of the general education is about being the content specialist, planning most of the curriculum, creating the learning targets, pacing it out, making sure that you're using the Kentucky academic standards and that they're aligned, The activities that you use have the proper supplemental aids and services and accommodations, that you are the macro planner lead, so that when you think about those big ideas, because you are the content specialist, you should be able to help plan intentionally with the special education teacher. And that when you're working on your lesson plans, if you don't have time to share the lesson plans, the building of them at a single day of the week or a specific time, that you use other ways to support that shared lesson planning, like creating it on a Google document where that you can share it, and the notes can be entered by both parties, but prior to the delivery of the instruction. And if their notes need to be added, then we add them before Friday, so that both teachers have access to reviewing them. The role of the special education teacher is different. When we are thinking about the gen ed teacher, we think they're going to be supporting specially designed instruction after the initial delivery. But the role of the special education teacher is primarily the delivery, the planning, the documenting, the evaluating, adjusting it, is really about the specially designed instruction. It is not to be another general education teacher. Again, when we're talking about co-teaching and we're talking about the different models, these four are the ones that we need to be implementing. It's the ultimate goal is to increase student engagement and achievement. And we cannot do that if we're underutilizing our time. If you want to know more information about co-teaching, we have two modules that are on our website. One is co-teaching in the middle school and high school math classroom. And then there's also an overview of co-teaching practices. Now let's just go back to student engagement. I referred to it a few minutes ago, and I want to make sure that we're in line with John O'Connor's quote, "When you have two teachers in the classroom, you should see small group instruction routinely. Each of the teachers should be leading a small group of students in an instructional activity." When we have two teachers in the classroom, we both need to be being as impactful as possible.
All right. Round up. So thank you guys so much for learning with us today. Kim and I appreciate the opportunity. It's always good when a special education teacher and a general education teacher, when we can work together, there's power in the two. And we appreciate you diving in. And we hope that you will take a few minutes and pause, get a drink, stretch, check out nature outside, spend time with your furry friend or your potted plants or your family, whichever you prefer, and then dive into Tuesday's videos with Marissa and Amelia and check out the learning there. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. We look forward to seeing you. You'll see us again on
Wednesday.
Wednesday.